My name is Robert Williscroft, and I'm an adventurer. Not your everyday kind of an adventurer, however. I've spent 22 submerged months on submarines. I've spent countless hours as a saturated diver deep under the water. I spent 3 years up in the Arctic ice pack conducting research, a year at the equatorial Pacific conducting research looking for manganese nodules, and a year at the geographic South Pole in charge of National Science Foundation atmospheric research. And that was probably my greatest adventure. I spent a full year, actually 13 months, at the geographic South Pole. I was the scientist in charge of atmospheric research, but I was also the station fire marshal because of prior shipboard experience that I had had. There were 17 of us, and we were in isolation for 9 months. During the period right after we went into isolation, as fire marshal, I drilled the guys in every conceivable way that we might have a fire, if for no other reason, to be prepared in case we did have one. About 2/3 of the way into the isolation period, we had drilled in every location on the station except for what we called the fuel arch. Now, the station was a 60-foot high geodesic dome. There were 2 steel archway buildings on both sides of the dome, and then my lab was about 100 yards upwind of the fuel arch. I began to have a guilty conscience about not having drilled in the fuel arch. The reason we hadn't is that we'd tried to burn the fuel using blow torches, but it wouldn't burn, and we assumed we probably couldn't have a fire there. Nevertheless, I went to the station manager, and we set up and had a full day drill. We pulled out all the stops and had a great time looking at every possible contingency, we thought. Well, about 3 days later, I was in my lab when the fire alarm went off, and the station manager got on our announcing system and said we had a real fire, and lo and behold, the fire was in the fuel system. It took me a few minutes to get my heavy-duty clothing on, and then I had to traverse 100 yards, and the temperature outside was colder than 100 degrees Fahrenheit below zero, and we were at 10,000 feet of altitude, so I had to do this 100-yard run with 50 pounds of clothing under those conditions. I got to the door at the end of the fuel arch, opened the door, and a blast of hot air and fire knocked me over. I pushed the door shut with my feet, and then I had another 100 yards to go to get into the main entrance of the station to the other side of the fuel arch. Thinking all the time, I wonder what I'd gotten myself into, because I didn't have a clue how we were going to actually fight this real fire. When I got there, the fellas were together, and we had to do something, and we had to do it quick. We dressed up, we put on Scott air packs, we went into the fuel arch area, and at each end of the fuel arch were some large coils of firefighting hoses that were supposedly filled with Purple K, a powdered dry fire retardant. We started to pull these off the reels, but the hoses shattered just as if they were made out of glass because it was so cold, so that ended that possibility. We ended up carrying fire extinguishers in, and we managed to beat the fire down eventually and get it out. One of the fellows actually had to wade across this large bladder that was filled with diesel fuel at 80 below zero just to get to a place to remove the electricity so that we could ultimately stop the whole condition. And we survived. I'm here. I'm telling you about it. But that clearly was one of the most exciting things that I've ever done. When you talk about the most dangerous thing I've done, however, I have to take you to the other end of the world, up in the Arctic ice pack in the Bering Sea at the close of summer. I was on the NOAA ship Surveyor. We were conducting ice surveys up there, and I had been in the ice pack with several of my guys, and we were diving underneath the ice. The ice was fairly loose, and there was nothing particularly dangerous about this. The ship was standing off the ice edge about 1.5 miles or 2 miles at the time, doing other work. And when we were done with our dive, we called the ship. They sent a Boston whaler in and picked up the fellas and the gear, and there was just me and one other guy left. We had a radio, we had our dive masks, we had our fins and our outfits that were keeping us warm, and the boat left to go back to the ship, and that's when the fog came in, and that's when the waves came up. And in short order, we were completely enveloped in fog. the ice around us was beginning to break up into smaller and smaller pieces, and the ice floe that we were standing on, which was maybe 10 yards by 5 yards or so, broke across the short way, literally between our legs. I had to jump from one side to the other just to get the radio, and then as the pieces began to separate, I jumped into the water holding the radio over my head and swam over to the other floe, which was now not much bigger than a tabletop, and here the two of us are standing on that. I'm talking to the ship saying, "Hey guys, it would be a real good idea if you got that boat over here to get us out of here." They had lost us in the swell on the radar. They knew we were somewhere along the ice edge, and they eventually did get to us. And obviously, we survived because, again, like I said, I'm here telling you about it. But that was probably the closest I came to finding my way to the great beyond without the help of anyone around. Adventuring is in some people's blood. And in my case, I think that my greatest strengths as far as adventuring and the world off the beaten path goes is when I'm underwater, when I'm doing things underwater that other people haven't done, when I'm out in the wilderness where there are no road marks, there are no road maps, where GPS isn't working and I have to use what's around me in order to find out where I am and where I'm going to go. Navigation by the seat of your pants under those conditions is another big strength that I've got. And finally, just surviving in the ice, surviving in sea ice, knowing where to go, how to stay alive, how to find food, and how to exist when there's no land within hundreds of miles of you, would put the capstone on what I can do as an adventurer.